I think that when this started out, the idea behind a lot of these was privacy. A lot of these platforms had very high level of privacy. It was very difficult to get into these platforms. The idea was that everyone was trying to conduct these negotiations, just conduct their business in the private, away from the eyes of researchers, from law enforcement, etc.
Welcome to Unspoken Security by ZeroFox, the raw and gritty podcast for cybersecurity professionals who want to understand how threat actors are leveraging the internet. In each episode, your host AJ Nash engages with various industry experts to dissect current trends, share practical insights, and address the blunt truths surrounding security. Ultimately, the lessons learned will enable security professionals to take an intel-driven, proactive approach to physical and cybersecurity that extends past the perimeter. Let's get started.
This is how legends are made.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unspoken Security, brought to you by ZeroFox, the only unified external cybersecurity platform. I'm your host, AJ Nash. For those who don't know me personally or are first-time listeners, I'm a traditional intelligence guy. I spent about 20 years in the intelligence community, both with the U.S. Air Force and then as a defense contractor. Most of that time was spent at NSA. I've been in the private sector for about 8 years now. I primarily build or help other people build effective intelligence-driven security practices. I'm passionate about intelligence, security, public speaking, mentoring, and teaching. I'm also deeply committed to servant leadership, which is why I completed my master's degree in organizational leadership at Gonzaga University. Go Zags. We're having a tough year this year on the courts, but I think they'll pull it out. So listen, the goal of this podcast is to bring all these kind of elements together with some incredible guests like what we have today. And we're going to have some authentic conversations, unfiltered conversations, really debates sometimes, how we might argue with each other about a whole wide range of challenging topics. It's not your typical podcast. This isn't going to be all polished. It's not a bunch of fancy audio and video graphics going through, and it's not a big sales pitch. We're not doing that crap. Here, it could be anything. It's going to be really just gritty, right? You might hear or see my dog. She's around here someplace. People might swear here. I know I'm known to. And we might argue, as I've said before, and that's all okay. So think of this podcast as the conversation you might overhear at a bar after a long day at one of the larger cybersecurity conferences that we're all going to be at here pretty soon. So these are the conversations we usually have when nobody's listening. Now, today, my guest is Roman Sannikov. Roman's awesome. He's an expert on all things related to cyber and threat intelligence, particularly when it comes to the cyber criminal underground. I've been lucky enough to travel a little bit with him and speak on these subjects and actually watch him speak more than anything, and he's just brilliant. So he started his career working at FBI, and then after that moved into the private sector. He's worked with some of the biggest and most well-known companies in our industry. Right now, he's leading his own consulting firm as president of Constellation Cyber LLC, where he helps companies around the world produce and benefit from threat intelligence. Roman, welcome to the show today. And is there anything I left out that you want to add to your intro?
AJ, thank you so much for having me. This is great. So my goal for today is to find a topic that we vehemently disagree on so we can have an actual argument. And to get that going, I actually had, 3 or 4 beers before this so that,
Great.
in the spirit of that happy hour after DEF
Yeah,
CON meetings and stuff like that. So I really
absolutely.
got into the mood here. And yeah,
Well,
so
I'm
hopefully
glad.
we can find a heated topic that we disagree on. It's unlikely because I know we've
Hasn't
spent
happened
some
yet.
time chatting, and unfortunately, we pretty much agree on most anything. But maybe if we have time, maybe we get into some sort of a sports disagreement or something at
We'll,
the end or something
we'll
we
figure it
can.
out. I'm glad you're gassed up.
Yeah.
This, unfortunately, is non-alcoholic, so I won't be able to catch up. But, as anybody who knows me, I'm fiery enough all on my own. So we should be all right. But no, man, I appreciate it. Yeah, maybe we'll find some things that we do disagree on. We'll see as we get in. It hasn't been much yet, but, if we do, that's what this is all about. So
Awesome.
listen, the title of today's episode is True Stories of the Dark Web. Now, listen, that's the kind of title, it's the topic that almost everyone wants to learn more about because there's all the mysteries surrounding what goes on in all these areas where most people can't see or they just can't participate, right? So, but before we get into the real discussion, it occurs to me there's a lot of different terminology here, right? And so there's a lot of possible misconceptions or misunderstandings when we talk about, say, the deep web versus the dark web versus the cyber criminal underground versus criminal marketplaces, all these other terms, right? So as an expert, one of the measures of an expert is how somebody can take something complicated and large and quickly boil it down into something that any dope like myself can understand. So, can you help make sure myself, the audience, we're all speaking the same language here on deep web, dark web, cybercriminal underground, all these terms, right? What are we talking about, man?
Sure. Before I say that, you
Yeah, man.
gave me the subtitle from the book I'm gonna write. So the title was gonna be "How Dark is the Dark Web," and the subtitle is gonna be "True Tales from the Dark Web."
Nice.
But
All right.
there you
I'd like
go.
a
So
royalty
so
now.
thank you.
You're gonna owe me
Absolutely,
8%.
absolutely.
I don't
There
even
you go.
know. I don't know what it is. Go ahead,
Um,
man.
so it's actually a great question, and part of the problem is something that we might actually talk about later, is
Mm,
that a lot of times these terms are used partly as marketing. So everybody has their own way to describe it, and I know some organizations actually vehemently disagree about what to call this. Essentially, what we're talking about is a an area of the web, of the internet, that is difficult to access. So that has barriers to access. So typically the way we used to define it is it's something that, Google isn't going to analyze, isn't going to scrape. Although even that's not necessarily the case. I've seen posts from Exploit and from other major
mhm.
forums commented or reflected on Google searches and things like that. But essentially, what we're talking about is an area of the internet, an area where individuals communicate relatively openly because there is a barrier to entry. So the barrier could be either financial, meaning you have to pay, or it could be
Mhm.
reputational. You have to be vouched in by someone. You have to know someone to gain access to this platform. Or in a lot of times, in a lot of cases, both. You have to both know someone and you have to pay. So, but essentially, that's kind of what we're talking about. It's something that barrier to entry.
Got it. All right. So they're sort of closed environments, right? And so unless I'm mistaken, they're just in the deep in the dark. It's sort of depends on how you look at it, right? There's the open web we all know about. That's that
Yep.
indexable, Googleable web, right? And then people talk about that's what's that 10%, 20% of the web. The
Mhm.
number always changes depending on which ice structure you want to look at. That's in a graphic on somebody's slide, but it's a small fraction, right? And then
Mm.
then you got the deep, and then the dark. If I understand, is that's where the dangerous stuff is. Like the deep is just
Mhm.
stuff that's not easy to get through Google, but it's not necessarily nefarious.
Mhm.
It's just the rest of the web. It's sort of like the radio stations that aren't assigned, but they're out there, right? For those who are old enough to care about radio
Well, it
anymore.
could it could also just be things that are proprietary, things that
Mhm.
are part of a corporation, part of some sort of network that again is somehow closed off, and things like that. So the dark web typically is what we talk about when we're talking about malicious activity. It's something that the reason I think we call it dark is because it's hiding in the shadows.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
specifically wants us as researchers, as law enforcement, as other individuals to not
Mhm.
be able to see what they're doing. So I think that's the easiest way to kind of look at it, is really something that is purposely hidden from view.
Got it. Okay, so this is the place where you can buy or sell pretty much anything when it comes down to it, right? Whether it's products, services, or horrible things, right? Happen. So
Exactly.
got it. All right, cool. So I think we're all on the same page now. Hopefully that makes it easy for people to understand, what we're talking about here. So let's just jump in, man. You've been doing this for a long time. I'm not to be insulting. We're both kind of old at this point. So experienced, right? Seasoned. Those are better words for old, I think. But we've been doing this a while. You've been doing this a while specifically, which means you're one of the most knowledgeable people I know on the subject. And you go back away, and again, not to poke at this case, but things have changed over time. Like somebody who's been doing
Hmm.
this a long time, like any environment, just like anything. Pick a social media platform, right? We've seen them change over the years, but you've seen all that going on in these spaces, in these deep and dark spaces, right? So, can you talk a little bit about what have you seen in terms of changes over the last, years, 10 years, decades, and maybe what have you seen that hasn't changed? What are the consistencies when we get into these environments in the deep and the dark web, man?
So I'm going to switch that question around a little bit. I think I'm going to talk
Sure,
about
why
things
not?
that
It's not like I wrote it for us or anything. Go ahead.
haven't changed.
No, go ahead, man.
I'm
Switch it
just gonna
around.
flip it. Don't get
That's
offended. I'm just gonna flip it. That's all. I'll
Oh,
get
you
to
just
both
reversing the
parts.
order?
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, all
Exactly.
right.
That's
That's
all.
sure.
That's
Go
all.
for it. All
There we
right,
go.
cool.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I'm gonna focus on what hasn't changed because I
cool.
think that's kind of fundamental to what the purpose of the dark web is, of this underground. Let me just call it that, so that
Mhm,
we don't
mhm.
offend any companies about the
Sure.
naming. So is the reason you have this area is because you have essentially, when you're talking about cybercrime, you're talking about individuals conducting business, people who don't know each other, people who have never seen each other most of the time, people who have very little kind of control over each other and each other's actions. And at the same time, they have to trust individuals who are criminals, who are
Hmm.
inherently not very trustworthy. That's why there's that saying, no honor among thieves, is they're not very trustworthy. They will rip you off if they can. And essentially, the underground provides a some sort of community that allows these threat actors, these individuals, these criminals to have some sort of recourse. So if you're in a community like a forum, like a Telegram channel, like a Discord channel, where there's other individuals, if you do something illicit, if you rip somebody off, if you do something that will that has the potential of ruining your reputation with others. So then you will have a harder time conducting business with other individuals, be it selling it, buying it, etc. So essentially, I think sometimes for sales purposes, companies will say, forums are dead, or this, or chat is dead, or this and that is dead. And I disagree. I think there's always going to be a need for some sort of place. Yes, threat actors may eventually go to private messaging, but there's a need for this initial area where individuals who don't know each other, who haven't worked together, can come together and have some level of comfort in giving money to someone who's a criminal and think that you're going to get something back from them that somehow resembles what you want. And forums in these places, channels, and etc., they've created things like escrow services, similar to when you're buying a house or something like that. There's reputational damage. There's all sorts of ways that they've worked out over the years to create that level of trust so that they can work together. Obviously, they're working together for a bad cause, but still, you have to look at it from just the operational needs and operational necessities. So I think that's something that's stayed even when when again, the threat actors, the bad guys, the criminals have moved from, be it from forum to forum, from forum to shop, from shop to Telegram channel to Discord to
Hmm.
Jabber to whatever it may be. The idea behind all of this has been the same, that there has to be some way to communicate, to conduct transactions when you're not being able to like literally hand somebody a suitcase or a duffel bag full of cash and receive some drugs right there on the spot in return. So yeah, I think that's something that's maintained.
Well, that makes a good, you made a good point in there, right? Or a couple of them, actually several. But you talked about, I know people talk about, hey, this is going to go away. People can go to one-on-one relationships, etc. And I think you're exactly right. There's supposed to be a place to meet. I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, it's not the world's best example, but sort of like dating. People still go and meet people. They meet
Hmm.
at bars. I realize people go to apps now too, but even that's its own community at some level before
Hmm.
you meet in the app or whatever. There's still got to be some place where you can come in and meet strangers, right? And then from
Hmm.
there, you figure out if you can, split off and go to these one-on-one relationships or these small group relationships. But there has to be a place to start.
Right.
And as you said, criminals, not surprisingly, not the most trustworthy group of people or the most trusting group of people. So
Hmm.
and you don't have a better business bureau. You don't have anybody, to be these middlemen and women, this ratings. So you have to have something. I know we talked about it before. It's a community for people who aren't good at community,
Hmm.
basically. Like by definition, criminals aren't generally great at being part of society, right? To a point, right? We can go into a lot of detail there, but the fact is they live a little outside the boundaries usually, right? So a community for people who aren't great at community, that's not going to go away. I agree with you. I think we are seeing more of that move to let's do this quickly and let's move someplace quieter and Discord and Telegram and those kind of things, right? And there's collections in those areas now too. But there has to be a place to meet. There has to be a place to start. You can't just get on Telegram and find a person
Hmm.
necessarily, right? You got to have a place where you're going to start. And you mentioned some really important pieces that I don't think people think about is the other services go with this, like escrow services. Like I know there's an appeals process if somebody has a
Hmm.
complaint. Like there's a whole system to this that has been around
Absolutely.
for a while. And these reputation pieces. That's a pretty strong infrastructure. So I'm
Yep.
with you in that I think this is still going to continue to be like that first area that a lot of these criminals come to. So it's nice to hear you say that hasn't really changed much over the years. That seems to be enduring. So what have you seen? I think you were done with what hasn't changed. If you're not, you'll
Mhm.
just tell me and keep going. But what have you seen that have been the big changes? In your mind, what the trends over the decades that you've been seeing this go on? What are you seeing as big changes, man?
I just to follow up on what you said, I agree completely with what you said. It kind of makes me think of those T-shirts that you see, the antisocial social club. Whenever I see those, that's what I think of is these dark web forums and
Mm-hmm.
and channels and exactly. But for those who may not know, things like escrow services are literally where you have a trusted individual on a platform like a forum and you go to them and you say, okay, I'm going to conduct a transaction. I'm going to sell a bunch of credit cards, stolen credit cards to someone else. Once they send you the agreed upon amount, you
Mm-hmm.
tell me that you have the money. I send the cards to that individual. And then once that individual confirms that they have the cards, they'll let you know you release the money to me. That's how it works. Again, very
Mm-hmm.
similar to when you're buying a house or something like that. And I know that the mechanics are different between things like Telegram channels and Discord channels and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. But I think that's more important for the threat intel providers because of how they collect the information, how they scrape the information, how they get access to this information. But for real intel, I don't think it matters that much. I think these are all still that dark web platforms where the communication happens. Getting back to your question, how things have changed is I think that when this started out, the idea behind a lot of these was privacy. A lot of these platforms had very high level of privacy. It was very difficult to get into these platforms. The idea was that everyone was trying to conduct these negotiations, just conduct their business in the private, away from the eyes of researchers, from law enforcement, etc. At some point over the course of the last maybe 6, 7 years, there's been a bit of a shift. And that is the way I see it is there's kind of this more open communication between researchers and threat actors. You'll
Hmm.
see when I was at one of the companies that I won't mention right now, but one of the companies we got into a little bit of heat because we published an interview with a pretty prominent threat actor
Yep, I
by
remember
one of my
this.
colleagues and I had the pleasure of actually translating this interview and editing for clarity and helping with some of the questions and stuff like that. And we got some heat
Hmm.
because it was seen as we were promoting and kind of making this individual more of a celebrity. I disagree because I think that to me, it seems silly that somehow individuals who would read this interview would somehow think, oh, yeah, this guy is 100% correct. It's kind of like, I don't know, listening to the interview with Putin and saying, maybe this guy isn't the killer. Maybe he's,
Maybe he's on to
he's got some
something.
good points. Yeah, exactly. I don't think that a lot of people in the industry all of a sudden decided that, you know what? I don't think I'm going to go after these ransomware guys anymore. I think they are just a bunch of good pen testers,
Hmm.
etc. So I think that that was just kind of this level of animosity that some people in our industry have against these individuals, and it prevents us from kind of opening up our minds and really seeing the world through their eyes, which I think is really key to understanding their motivation, what they're doing, how they're doing it. It's like, really you need to know the enemy
Absolutely.
to understand what's going on. And so I think so I'm kind of going off the topic a little bit,
Mm.
but my point is that I think over the course of the last 5, 6 years, there's been like more of this openness. So you're communicating relatively openly. I've been able to ping individuals openly as they know who I am, they know what they do. And I've asked them, I said, hey, I think that this is happening in the cyber criminal. What is your take on this? And, again, not to say that I take everything they say as gospel truth, but
Wait a minute,
I
you can't
think
trust them? Is that we're back to that again? You can't trust these guys? No?
trust but verify.
Trust but verify,
So there you
absolutely.
go. Yes. But yeah, but I think it is important to, and honestly, they like being listened to. So
Mhm.
believe it or not, when they have a bit of a platform and people ask them, I think a lot of times, maybe they won't be completely honest about what they're doing specifically. But when you ask them a more general question about trends and about methodologies and TTPs, I've found that they're actually fairly open in this collaboration. And kind of a funny twist to that, back when I used to work with the FBI and when we used to arrest individuals who were engaged in criminal activity and cybercrime,
Mhm.
particularly cybercrime, maybe not all criminal activity, but cybercrime, very frequently after we had our kind of sit down and we'd arrest and go through all of this stuff like that, literally within like a day or two, they'd be like, "Hey, Roman, how do you become an FBI agent?" You know, and I would invariably say, "Well, you kind of start out by not committing felonies.
Right.
That's
Off
a
to a
really
bad
good
start.
start." Yeah, but it's like a lot of them would cooperate and they would feel like all of a sudden they're part of the team and they're on, Team America or team, whatever country they had been picked up by. But again, I think that one of the things I've seen, again, this transition is that there is a much more open level of communication between the bad guys and the researchers.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that that's necessarily improved everything, because obviously we still have a huge problem with cybercrime and with criminal activity, but I think that if we as researchers, as security professionals are smart, we will take that information, we'll incorporate that information. I've listened to a few of your podcasts before, and we will put it into intelligence
Right.
and we will help
Exactly.
make the better decisions for our clients. So I think that's one of the things that's definitely changed, is
Mm.
this kind of new level of openness. And I think a lot of that has come out of the fact that a lot of these threat actors realize that a lot of their platforms have been infiltrated by
Mhm.
law enforcement, by researchers. And so it's kind of this bit of a cat and mouse thing. And to some extent, it reminds me of, again, when I was working with the FBI, a lot of the work I did contractually was also investigating organized crime. And
Mhm.
a lot of times we would monitor these Russian organized crime groups, and sometimes it'd be other organized crime as well, not just Russian. But a lot of times they would be hanging out literally in the same bars and restaurants as the cops and the agents and stuff like that. And
Sure.
so essentially they were kind of rubbing elbows, and it reminds me what's happening in the cybercrime now kind of reminds me of that a little bit. Is essentially we're kind of rubbing virtual elbows very frequently with these threat
Mhm.
actors.
Well, and it's
So
interesting. I this reminds me of something years ago now, but psychological profiles have been done, and the psychological profile between a police officer and a criminal are almost identical. Like, you can't tell who's who, apparently. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so if somebody's listening and wants to correct me on all the details, I'm good with that. But as I recall, if you put them next to each other, they're essentially the same profile, and it's one of those mysteries of what makes somebody choose one side or the other, right? Because people are very much wired the same in terms of their acceptance of risk, and and some of the other motivations they have. It's just you end up on one side or the other. So it's not surprising to hear, you mentioned it with organized crime, both in the physical world and talk about the cyber criminals. It's not surprising to hear that they want to mingle and mix.
mhm,
These are same kinds of people. They're just on the opposite side of the discussion, right?
yeah,
So, but it's interesting. I think the point you made. I remember the presentation years ago when there was a presentation and you guys were talking about this specific actor, which everybody knew who this guy was anyway. It's not
mhm,
like you guys made him famous. But I remember some of that hubbub of
mhm,
should they have done that or not? These guys want fame and fortune, and now you're highlighting this, and it is interesting you mentioned how much that's changed now, because that was, oh god, that had to be 7 years ago, I bet, give or take. So it's interesting now that you're saying, yeah, it's just kind of a normal thing, which it is. I know
mhm,
researchers that talk with criminals out there and get information. And like you said, they
mhm,
won't rat on themselves, but they'll tell you trends and some interesting stuff.
mhm.
And knowing your enemy is really important. It's any way you can find out about them. And so I agree with you. I think that's a really interesting point, that's changed a lot. What about specific, like, TTPs or scams out there, like romance scams, for instance, or pig butchering or whatever? Like, there's a lot of them out there. Are these? Have you seen an evolution of things? Have new things arrived that didn't used to exist, or have things just improved over time? Like, what have you seen in some specific scams or TTPs?
Man, so the couple that you mentioned, and I know we've talked about this before, this is something that kind of like breaks my heart because these are some of the earliest scams that I helped work on. One of the very first cyber related scams or cases I worked on back around 2002 was actually so we were working with some Russian law enforcement, MVD individuals, and this is back when we were all sort of on the same
Friends still.
side. Yeah, exactly, and kind of this halcyon years for
Hmm.
about maybe 10 years or so before things went well.
Backwards.
Yeah, I was going to use a slightly more colorful
Yes.
term, but yes, they came to us and they said, "Look, we've got these three individuals in this, fairly large city in the middle of Russia that are scamming people all over the world, like $3,000 to $4,000 at a time. But they've gotten
Mhm,
to the point where they have about $500,000 worth of scams that they've done, and they wanted people to submit cases to them.
mhm,
They need because all the crimes are committed outside of Russia,
mhm,
and so they needed victims. They needed individuals to, and they had victims from Australia, from Canada, from various states in the United States, Finland, just all over the world. And I remember specifically, again, with the FBI's blessing and through the FBI, but reaching out to some of the law enforcement organizations, regional organizations in Texas and a couple other places where these victims had were located. And the attitude was really, if they sent, $3,000 to some Natasha, thinking she was going to come over, then,
right.
that's on them kind of thing.
No empathy, no sympathy.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely not. And in the end, the only country that did submit these was China, from what I
Interesting.
recall. But none of the Western countries took it seriously enough. And that's what's heartbreaking is because now, 20 years later, over 20 years later, we have people who are essentially falling for the same scams.
Mhm,
The pig butchering scams, almost all the pig butchering scams start with a romantic relationship. There's some sort of, and can't help but think that had we taken this more seriously 20 years ago, had we
mhm,
done more education 20 years ago, had we had more empathy 20 years ago, then I think there would be a level of maturity in victims, in
mhm,
individuals that would prevent a lot of this from happening. And so, like I said, that really breaks my heart. In terms of one of the things that has changed is really what we're seeing is a lot of people kind of outside the industry and surprisingly to me, even inside the industry, sometimes people that clients who we talk to, they still have this image of a hacker from like a 1990s movie or something like that, where it's some usually guy who basically does everything from hacks in the computer, transfer funds, cashes out funds, goes to the ATM, grabs the
right.
funds or
Does end
whatever,
to end. Yeah.
starts exactly.
Exactly, it's
And
criminal.
exactly. And this is something that really hasn't been the case
Mhm,
for many, many years now. And it seems like almost every year they're coming up with a new platform, a new way to, ransomware as a service. Before that, there was
mhm.
DDoS as a service, exploit kits. It's almost kind of like when you think about, I don't know how many people of your viewers remember Jack London, but this is
Mm.
a person who went to the Klondike to strike it rich, found no gold, but
Right.
figured out that he could make it rich by writing stories and by all
Mhm,
that kind of stuff. In a lot of these places, the people who are actually making it rich, making a lot of the money, are the ones who are providing the infrastructure. So ransomware, these aren't the individuals who are breaking in and who are literally ransoming you. These are the individuals that are providing it as a service. They created a
mhm,
platform. They created this mm, business model. And the same thing, I worked with one of the first individuals who created malware as a service where they rented malware, which made it so much more difficult for us because in the before that we could get a sample, we could buy the malware,
mhm.
and then we had control over it. We could reverse it. We could have something. And this young man, very smart guy who I still keep in touch with. Fortunately, is on the straight and narrow now and is a productive member of society. But he created the idea that hey, why would I give something to them? Let me rent it. This way I still
Mhm.
maintain control over it. And it
Smart.
was so much harder for us because we didn't get the samples. We couldn't. So that's something that's changed. And again, now you're seeing fraud as a service. You're seeing all of these as a service things where people where the criminals are really specializing on specific services and really making their money that way, as opposed to, doing the whole soup to nuts and opening themselves up to so much more risk.
Right. Well, yeah, and they piece it out, right? I mean, these are smart business people, So if you're in carding, you're not like you said, you're not getting the cards. You're not doing the skimming. You're not doing the fraud work. You're not doing the cash outs. You got mules to do bits and pieces. You're selling pieces around. Like
Hmm.
you're not doing everything
Hmm.
because you can specialize. It also, it lowers your exposure. Like you
Yep.
got little bits and pieces to handle some of that, so the exposure changes, and then you're taking your fractions off of all of that stuff. So it's I mean, it's smart business. Listen, these are not
Hmm.
dummies, right? I mean, the people in this enterprise are very bright, generally speaking, and savvy business people.
Hmm.
They just happen to have a business model that's not legal, but it is really, really effective and
Hmm.
efficient. I hear things like $500,000 in cash, and I think maybe I'm on the wrong side of the business, but I'm not. Don't worry, don't call the FBI. But I get a little jealous by the money occasionally. But a lot of these guys go down. So okay, so we've talked a bit about what you've seen in terms of what didn't change over time, some of the things that have changed, and some of the new trends and new technologies are out there and tactics and techniques like ransomware. Frankly, I've just had a discussion on ransomware, an episode that just went out actually not too long ago, and we went into detail on ransomware and double ransomware and triple ransomware
Hmm.
and quadruple. So if anybody's listening to this and didn't listen to the episode with Brian Stack from Experian, I recommend you go back and catch that because he did a real good deep dive on that as well. It's a very cool piece. But knowing all of that, the next question is what are people doing wrong in terms of deep dark web, or how are they thinking wrong about the deep and dark web? We have all these misconceptions. Like you said, there's vendors out there that are doing this work. We've got companies that are, in my opinion, foolishly setting up their own efforts to try to do it, which is really dangerous. I will say
Hmm.
this, for the 80th time probably in my career at this point. First of all, you shouldn't set up your own deep and dark web collections. Don't do it. Don't get out there. If you're not a professional and expert, it's a bad idea. I tell people it's sort of like going into a biker bar wearing a suit and tie. Even if you can get in the door, and you probably shouldn't, it's going to be clear you don't belong. Nobody's going to really interact with you, and there's a chance you're going to get hurt. So
Just put a
this is
helmet on and some dark sunglasses, and you're good.
right. You'll be
You're
fine.
good.
Fake
Yeah,
mustache, you'll be good.
exactly.
But I
Yeah.
always tell people, and I know people have said it seems self-serving because I work in this industry, on the vendor side. But listen, I worked at a bank before, and I said the same thing. Don't set this stuff up yourself.
Hmm.
There are certain things you always want to outsource, and I would say deep and dark web is one of those things that you just want to outsource. The time, the effort, the energy, the risk. It's just not worth trying to do yourself. But anyway, the question was for you, not for me. What are people doing wrong in terms of deep and dark web, or what are their misconceptions? When it comes to these spaces.
And so there's a lot of things that, how many hours do we have? So one of the things that I'll just touch on really quickly, because I already kind of mentioned it earlier. I think we as an industry have a little bit kind of too much of this us versus them mentality.
Mm,
You know, they're all scumbags and they're all horrible and they're all evil, which may be the case. I would say that probably not all of them are scumbags, but a good percentage of them are, people of low moral, values.
mhm.
But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't interact with them, that we shouldn't listen to them when they say things, that we shouldn't try to see things through their eyes. And that's something that I think a lot of times there is a lack of. I think a lot of times there's too adversarial a relationship. There's kind of, I mean, I'm sure you've seen like my job is punching bad guys in the nose kind of thing. And it's funny,
It's good marketing.
but when you really, again, I laugh at that. That's cool. I want to do that too.
Right.
But when you take that too seriously and when that's really your attitude, then I think you're closing yourself off from a lot of valuable intelligence and from really understanding. Hey, the way I got into this, I was actually a translator and interpreter for many years,
Mhm,
working with the FBI as a contractor. And it turned out that I was able to understand the criminal element at first, organized crime, and
mhm.
then it's cybercrime, all these things, because I was able to kind of, again, I'm not saying I'm special in this. There's a lot of people who are wonderful at this, but I think my approach was, why are they doing this?
Mhm.
How is it, And so I think that really helped. Whereas a lot of people are like, these guys are just, take them out to the woodshed and stuff like that. In the long run, that doesn't help us understand, and that doesn't help us stop them, and that doesn't help us. So I think that's one of the things that we as an industry frequently get wrong. I can
Hmm.
go into a lot more detail on that, especially around things like ransomware, where I've gotten into some heated discussions with some people. But the other thing that also drives me nuts that I've come across recently is, talking to client companies, and I've heard some people say this, that they're going to people and they're like, well, we don't really care about the initial access, we don't really care about credentials, we don't really care about this stuff, we know that they're going to get in, we need to stop them once they get in, we need to. And it blows my mind, and it's
Hmm.
kind of like, we just had the Super Bowl, and to me, like, the analogy is kind of like, all right, it's like giving the other team the ball on the 50-yard line, because chances are they're probably going to cross the 50-yard line sooner or later anyway. Most, even when they don't get a touchdown or a field goal, most of the time they at least cross the 50-yard line. So
Right.
then why don't we just give them the ball at the 50 and focus on stopping them during that last, that drive and
Uh-huh.
stuff like that. That's essentially what we're saying. Well, we don't care about the initial access. And my argument is, if you're really focused on ransomware, you're too late,
Oh,
because you
exactly.
should be focused on that initial access, on trying to stop them from
Yeah.
coming in.
Well,
And it's not easy. I know credentials and
mm-mm.
all that stuff, but you can't, you know, i- intel is important.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like organizations that are saying they might be saying we don't care. I'm going to tell you my translation of that is they've just given up on. They
Yeah.
can't do it, so they've changed the message. We don't want to say we failed, so we'll just say, well, we don't care about that. We're not going to worry about that. We'll worry about it here. But you're waving the white flag. Listen, we're in security business. We're in intel business. It would be like saying, I don't care if you break in my front door. I assume everybody's
Hmm.
coming in the house. I'm just going to try to keep you from stealing my television. No,
Right.
I'm actually going to
Yeah.
try to keep you from getting in the front door. I've got a lock on the door. I've got a
Yep.
camera. I've got alarms. I've got dog. I'm going to try and
Hmm.
keep you from getting in the door. Like you
Hmm.
may get to the door, but I'm going to make that hard first. And then if you get in, I've got defense in depth and all that people talk about, right? It
Well, it's
sounds to
like,
me like people have just changed that conversation to say, well, we're not going to worry about that. It's because they've given up because they
yeah,
can't stop it, so they've given up, which is
yeah,
a weak position to take.
absolutely. I think, and partly maybe it's our fault, or maybe it's the marketing fault, because everybody's talking about, it's not if you get breached, it's
It's
when.
when,
But the thing is that you're not just going to get breached one time. It's
right,
not like if anybody ever saw the movie The World According to Garp, where
oh
they
yeah,
buy a house and the plane crashes into it, and Garp says, "You know what? We should buy it anyway, because it's disaster proof.
right, it's already
It's
happened.
already." Yeah. So that's not the case with
No,
cybercrime. I've talked to several companies this year that got popped by ransomware multiple times. So it's not
mhm,
like, okay, we got breached, all right, now we don't have to worry about
mm.
that ever again.
No, it's the
So,
opposite. This isn't lightning
yes.
striking. Criminals learn, all right? If I breach you and it works, I'm going to come back. I'm going to
Yeah.
keep coming back until you prove I can't get in the door. Like if you broke into my house, like using that same analogy, I leave the door open, you come in, you steal my stuff. You're going to come back. You already know you can get in the door. Like why wouldn't you come back until I either run out of things to steal or I lock the door? Like and I put an alarm up and I do some other things from a security standpoint. Why
Yep.
wouldn't a criminal continue to come in? Criminals care about success. They
Mhm.
they care about whatever they want to do, they want to succeed at. They want to steal the thing, they want to cash out. They care about success, care about not getting caught, and they care about value. And they're like water. They look for the path of least resistance. If you're not going to
Exactly.
provide resistance, as you said, to the 50-yard line, well, yeah, I'll take the ball there. I got a better chance of getting through. So, it's interesting because I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, there are some folks who've just kind of given up on stopping
Mhm.
these things, which is it's sad. And you're right. We've all said you're going to get breached eventually. It's true. We got to make sure they understand. Everybody gets breached. It doesn't mean you don't stop trying to get from getting breached because if you stop, you're going to get breached a hell of a lot more.
Yep.
This isn't binary. Have been or haven't been. You're all gonna be, but are you going to be breached once or 138 times?
Mhm.
Like you still have to try to keep them out at the door.
Mhm.
So I think that's interesting you mention it. The other one that comes to mind, I'm going to steal some of this a little bit because I know we talked a little about it. Is the organization say, we don't care who did it?
Mhm.
Drives me crazy. What do you mean you don't
Yep.
care who did it? We don't care who did it. We just want to stop it. Well, if you don't care who did it, you're gonna have a real hard time because you don't know what their motives were. You don't know how to stop it necessarily. You don't know where they're going now that they're in your org. You don't know if they're going to come back. Like
Mhm.
attribution matters. It's not you can do things without attribution. You absolutely want to stop the bleeding immediately, but I think it's much more important than people seem to think.
Mhm.
But what are you seeing? Are you seeing the same thing when we talk about attribution?
I saw a really great presentation recently about like recovery after a ransomware
Mm,
event, and I agreed with the vast majority of what the individual said. It was wonderful. But the one thing that again just made me jump out of my chair is he was very adamant about he doesn't care about attribution. Don't like throw that at me. I'm dealing with, well, you if you don't know who did it and what you don't know, I mean, they walked out, they didn't just
mhm,
lock your systems, they walked out with a lot of your data, a ton of
yep,
your data, and you don't know where that data went, and you don't know what's going to happen with that data. And that's actually like not to plug my company, but that's actually
sure you
my
can,
next
go ahead.
project that I'm working on now is specifically tracking the leaked data, a lot of these extortion
Mm,
sites, and looking at like the secondary and tertiary victims who
mhm,
don't know that they've been impacted by this, because it is so important, because you need to know, is this a nation state actor? Am I liable to be a victim of intellectual property theft
mhm,
as a result of, are my plans now being discussed at some company that's an adversary in a foreign place
mm,
at a hostile power? Is this a hacktivist? Is this some crazy individual? We've seen individuals shooting up power plants. you know is this something that is going to impact my physical security? So you can't just silo and say, you know what, all I care about is getting the systems back up, getting things running,
mhm.
getting my ship back up again. Excuse my language.
No, no, we
But
swear all the time here, don't worry about it.
you need to you need to have the background. You need to incorporate
Mhm,
that as well, because you need to deal with that. And that's actually goes to one of the other things that you and I've talked about is you know, sharing information within
mhm,
the industry. I understand, and I don't know how to deal with this. Honestly, I don't. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. But, you know, the advice to most victims of breaches is, unless it's PII, where you have to provide that information by law,
mm,
provide as little information as possible. We've been impacted by an incident. Well, what does that mean? What does that
yeah,
mean to your suppliers? What does that mean to your affiliates? What does that
mhm,
mean? So, what's been breached? And there isn't that sharing of information. And I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen as well, a lot of companies that are impacted. Again, not to kind of toot my own
sure,
horn,
sure,
but that's why I'm like working on this new project, is to specifically allow for these other entities to understand what of their data is now out there as a result of this
mhm,
breach, because I think it's so critically important. We're kind of sometimes, sticking our head in the sand and saying, well, these are bad guys. They're throwing it up on, bad guy channels. But just because we're not looking at it doesn't mean that the initial access brokers aren't looking at it. Doesn't mean that all these other individuals aren't looking at all of your data and now using it as a vector to go after you or your clients, your affiliates, etc.
right,
And I think that's one of the other things that the industry, or we as in general, have to figure out a better way to share that information, to figure out a way to, and maybe they'll kill my project and my company if we do that effectively. But I'm willing to take that chance, that
nobody's
risk,
done it
because
yet, so you're probably
I'm
safe.
I'm hoping that we get to the point where we figure out a way to share the information. Hey, listen, somebody broke into my house and stole this data or stole these documents, and
Mhm,
by the way, they happen to have that contract that you and I signed about this whatever, and so
mhm,
basically now they have all of your information about your activities and all
mm,
that kind of stuff. So somebody all of a sudden starts to, come to you about this type of stuff. Just remember that this is now out there in criminal hands. So we need to figure out a way to disperse that information
right. Well, like you
better.
said, we have it with PII, right? So, if your PII is compromised, I don't know about you, I've had letters from so many companies, "Hey, we're gonna give you this free tracking of your credit, because we screwed up and all your stuff's been stolen." So many times more than I count, right? But at least I get notified. Oh, okay, I gotta watch my credit a little bit, see if somebody's using my information, see if somebody's stealing my ID. Because with PII, they were required to tell us, and we all know this, right? And other things they keep quiet. I know I used to work in finance, and this is what the ISACs were designed in part to do was, they're sharing organizations. So if a bank gets breached, we should all get on a call. We should, they should be able to share. Here's everything we know. Here's the TTPs. Here's what they've taken. Here's what we think their motives are. Here's what we think it is. So everybody else can batten down the hatches and get ahead. So it doesn't become a series of events. But then the lawyers get involved and none of that happens. And again, I'm with you. I'm not blaming lawyers. They got a job to do. It's, where's the line between being transparent and taking on risk and how it's going to work? But ultimately, you end up having what would be, to put it in physical criminal terms, a murderer
Hmm.
becomes a serial killer
Yep.
because nobody mentioned the murder, and then the next one, and the
Yes.
next one, and nobody's sharing the information. There's a pattern here, it turns out.
Hmm.
And so this same person goes on murdering, in this case, just robbing banks
Hmm.
digitally because people didn't share the information. So it
Hmm.
becomes one after another after another. Great win for the criminals. Or you run into it. Yeah, we see the same thing with if you talk about pig butchering for that matter, you come back to that even. That's more
Yep.
personal, but people don't want to share because they're ashamed, right? So you
Right.
you have the risk factors with lawyers, and all those things that go with it from a business standpoint, but also people don't often share because they're ashamed. And that can even
Yep.
happen in business too, where some executive got breached, they don't want to tell anybody. I know you've seen it. I have too.
Hmm.
Ransomwares where they sideline it and pay it off themselves because they don't want anybody to
Hmm.
know about it. They just want to get their laptop back. And it never goes well, by the way. For anybody wondering, if you get compromised, if you're gonna go grab yourself some Bitcoin and think you're gonna solve it yourself, chances are pretty good you're not. I'm sure it's not within your company policy, so you're probably gonna make things a lot worse. You're just gonna pay off somebody who probably doesn't give you your stuff back anyway. So if you get had, just go talk to your security people immediately and just, this is what happened and try to deal with it. Don't go buying crypto and trying to solve it yourself. It doesn't go well. So anyway, yeah, I think that's all interesting stuff. And again, you talked about the attribution piece. I wonder if that isn't again just like the whole we don't care about breach. If it isn't just that people have said they've just given up. It's hard.
Hmm.
Attribution is really hard. So maybe
Yeah.
instead of saying we can't do it or it's hard, it's just we don't want it. It's sort of almost a sour grapes. We don't want that anyway.
Hmm.
Or maybe it's a matter of, and I'm curious what your thoughts are here on just prioritization. We can only do so many things in a day. We just accepted these are too hard to get done. So we're just going to say we're not going to worry about it. Important or not, we're just going to punt it because I don't have the time or the energy or the money to fix it, even though, as you said, it's going to cause all these other problems by not really knowing who did this and what their motives are and what the likelihood of return is and what they're likely to do with the things they've stolen. It's critical. It's very valuable. But organizations just move quickly and say, well, that's just too hard. It would take a lot of energy and a lot of time and money to try to figure it out. So I wonder if they're just punting because it's just hard. And they just say, well, we're not going to do it.
I think sometimes it's because they don't know how to use threat intelligence effectively, and maybe partly it's our own fault because we don't present it in the proper way. I don't know, but I think a lot of times because again, good threat intelligence can save you time. It's not just a cost center. So instead of getting spun up, I mean, most companies still get some sort of alerting about various incidents that may impact them.
Hmm.
So good threat intelligence will help you figure out, okay, is this threat actor, if we're talking about attribution, is this threat actor likely to do this? Is this threat
Hmm.
actor have the capability to do this? Is this someone who's just some random Joe Schmo that most likely isn't selling a 0 day to an Apple product for
Hmm.
$5,000?
Hmm.
And so essentially, it's a good way to actually get rid of a lot of the noise. People frequently think of intelligence as noise, as additional stuff that I have to worry about. But again, good threat intelligence or properly tuned threat intelligence actually helps you figure out what to focus on
Yep.
and what to ignore and make that calculated decision and then defend that decision
Hmm.
because sometimes you'll get it wrong sometimes,
Sure.
but if you can say, hey, look, based on these criteria I decided to give this less
Hmm.
attention, and chances are your leadership is going to be okay. They didn't screw up just because they were lazy. They had some sort of a factor why they didn't focus on this, etc. So
Yeah, you've
again,
got a
yeah.
methodology for scoring risk essentially, right? And so you
Yep.
figure out which things, because yeah, nobody has enough time or energy or money to do everything. Nobody has enough
Hmm.
people, so you got to be able to prioritize. But I'm with you. I tell
Exactly.
people a lot of times, Intel, it's tell them what happened, tell them what they can do about it, or tell them what happened, tell them why it's important, tell them what they can do about it. Right? Those are
Hmm.
the three things. But also one of the things I say is that Intel, we're the only ones that can tell them not to worry about it, or at least with
Hmm.
some level of confidence. You know, I know when I first went to the private sector, my first gig was at a bank, and I learned very quickly little differences between the government space and the private sector is people really freaked out about almost everything that was in the news right
Hmm.
away, it seemed like. And context was an issue. And early on, you're learning this stuff and you got, CISOs and they come down, they're just, freaking out and they want to know everything about everything and everything's on fire. But getting to the point where you could say, hey, boss, you really don't have to worry about this. And here's why. Like, I know the headline said that, but really, this is actually not a new thing. This has been around for years. It's a minor variation, or this is an organization that's not going to attack us. They've never attacked a bank ever. This is not their motivations, or whatever they
Mhm.
are, right? Helping the C level or the CISOs say, okay, I don't have to worry about this. Great, because I only got 612 other things I got to worry about. So that one I can take off my plate.
Chill,
Thank you.
Winston.
Yes. So I mean, it's nice to be able to take one away, right? And
Yep,
Intel can be really good at that
exactly.
with some level of confidence. This doesn't have to be your top thing today, boss. It might be tomorrow. We'll talk again, I'm sure.
Yeah,
But being able to tell them this isn't the thing, right? And so I think that's really important. And like you said, that does come from some of this attribution component, which is
exactly.
which is really, really challenging. So again, the show was really about, like, stories from the deep and dark web, right? We haven't even gotten into the really cool stories. We talked a little bit here and there, but you've been doing this a long time, man. So I keep saying that. I keep picking on you. I'm probably older, but the best part, I think, of all these discussions is the really cool stories, right? So what do you have, man? What do you have that's just, I'm sure you got a couple of things without naming names or shaming anybody, of course, whether it's customers or employers or whatever. But do you have some very cool stories or some myths you want to bust? Can I honestly hire, somebody to murder somebody on the dark web? Can I buy human beings on the dark web or kidneys? Are there myths you want to bust? Are there stories you want to share? What do you got that's really the cool stuff people are going to walk away going, holy cow, that's amazing?
So, as you've pointed out several times, I've been doing this for quite some time. So, I have a large library to choose from. So, I'm just going to give you a few teasers
Yeah, man.
because, these things can go on for quite some time. But one of the things that I remember being really fun was, man, this is probably around 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more. There was a really big case in the New York office and other offices called Aching Mules, and you can actually look it up. There was actually a CNBC special on this where some of my friends were interviewed, if FBI agents. And but the way one of the ways this started was actually three young ladies from Kazakhstan came into the New York office of the FBI, and because they had they were J1 students. They were here and they were kind of taking advantage of some guys, got them to do some illegal things, open bank accounts and stuff like that. And they were really freaked out. And their boyfriends told them, "You're stupid, you're going to go to jail, blah, blah, blah."
Hmm.
So they came and they kind of gave themselves up and they were,
Hmm.
and this was actually kind of how this case started. And they came to the office on a Saturday. New York office is one of the biggest FBI offices in the US or in the
Hmm.
world.
Hmm.
And the kind of intake agents downstairs, they had no idea what to do with these people. And so they called the Russian squad. And one of my friends, who's not a cyber guy, but was an interpreter on the Russian squad, he took down some of the notes and he's like, the Russian organized crime squad has no idea what to do with people, opening bank accounts and stuff like that. That's not what they usually deal
Right.
with. And so this stuff kind of got to my desk and I wound up looking through this. I'm like, holy crap, they're talking about, you know, literally driving with somebody who's got a laptop open, this older woman who was like, I think she owned a flower shop and she was transferring funds live from various victim accounts to this business account and then
Mm.
having this money transferred to these young ladies' bank accounts as though they were employees and stuff like that. And it wound up being actually a really big case
Mhm.
that spanned several years. And there was eventually a really big arrest where over 20 people were arrested at the same time across several different states. And it was really big. But one of the ways that it started out was actually just these young ladies coming in, and it
Mm.
totally, you know, uh, kind of by accident, it came across my desk. And then I went to the supervisor of the cybercrime squad. And I said, dude, this is our purview. This is,
Mhm.
us. And it took a little while to convince him. He's actually a friend of mine as well. But finally, he's like, all right, yeah, you're right. This does seem like there's some cybercriminal activity involved here. And again, it wound up being there was like millions of dollars
Three
coming in
million.
from
Yeah, I'm
places.
I'm cheating. You told me what it
Yeah,
was, and I looked it up. It's for those who wanna look up the full story on this one, by the way, it's September of 2010,
there you
when this
go.
all broke out. It's 37 mules, $3 million dollars. A very interesting story. The actual indictment is out there if you actually Google Aching Mules. That comes up and some interesting names there in the Southern District at the time, but also Wired has a good article on it. I'm sneaking a peek here. It's the advantage of doing this live and having a bunch of computers. So, yeah, $3 million, 37 people, 21 separate cases. Lots of Russian names is all the list
Yes.
of them here. Yeah, long list of Russian names, basically ages anywhere from 21 to 26. Oh, it's well, there's one 29-year-old in the group. So
Yeah.
really interesting stuff, man.
Yep.
And that must have been just really wild to work on. And this is 2010, so this is a while
Yeah.
ago. I mean, you're talking
Yeah.
not to make fun of you and age. This isn't about that anymore. But
Yeah.
14 years ago, when you said they didn't know what to do, right? This was not a
Uh-huh.
common thing yet, and
Yeah.
this is pretty new still comparatively.
Hmm.
So, like that's some of the early days, and that's a pretty sophisticated ring.
Yeah.
That's awesome stuff.
So one other case, just
Yeah, man.
really quick. So going back to my organized crime squad, those of you who are actually looking at this on YouTube or something, you see that I've got my golden locks hanging down. I was involved in a case where I was interpreting for a Russian organized crime investigation, and part of the case was I was working out of the Albany office of New York at the time, going to school up there, and we had this Russian, for lack of a better word, a head of a criminal family. And we invited him. We were trying to get him to do some criminal activity. The FBI essentially, were trying to get him to do some criminal activity there that they could monitor and arrest, et cetera, and break up the
Mhm,
gang.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so I went up to this very fancy schmancy resort in northern New York called Saranac Lake, I believe it was.
Mm,
And again, like really expensive with very kind of a lot of hoi polloi people. And this was up kind of in the Adirondacks or just outside the Adirondacks, so the reception there wasn't great. And we had to monitor the cooperating witness who was there hosting this bad guy because the cooperating witness at the time had, I think, $1 million bounty on his head.
oof.
He had been arrested. He was kind of one of these accountants for Russian organized crime groups. And so we had to make sure that he was going to be safe. And so what I was doing is I was walking around with this. Back then we had to have a suitcase, the silver suitcase that the receiver. And so I was listening to everything
Mhm,
that he was saying and the bad guy was saying to know that he's not taking him out to the woods and doing something horrible to him,
mhm.
like in one of these, Russian gangster movies. And at one point we lost him and we
Oh,
lost the guys, and it's a fairly big resort and we're running around trying to find where are they, want to make sure that they didn't take him out to the woodshed.
right.
And I come around the corner and I'm face to face with these guys. And I've got one of those like big earpieces coming out of my ear, very
Right,
inconspicuous, kind of like
right.
one of those old fashioned Secret Service agents with like wires hanging and all that.
Please tell me you had to
And
pretend you were deaf or something. Did you pretend it was a
no,
hearing
I
aid?
I
No?
I took my hair down.
Oh, yeah, sure,
I
the
untied
hair.
my hair
Perfect.
and it covered it, and it
Brilliant.
covered it really well. And so
Ah,
I wound up
brilliant.
sitting down and listening, and the guy had everybody there is wearing like white and very Hamptons kind of thing. And
Mhm.
this guy's there in these little tiny shorts and topless, and he's got his huge sun tattooed all on his back. And again, just like something out of Eastern Promises or something like
Sure.
that. And so I'm sitting behind him and just kind of like listening to make sure. But yeah, so that's where one fun time where my quaff helped the FBI case and made sure that this guy wasn't the
That's
cooperating
crazy.
witness wasn't harmed. So well, yeah,
That's
another
crazy,
fun
man.
case.
That's awesome. I didn't think about sure, the hair makes perfect sense. And again, for those who aren't watching, if you're just listening, which is perfectly fine, because with me, you're much better to listen than to watch me, I promise. But if you're not and you get on YouTube, you can see, Roman's got some pretty great hair. And yeah, it probably would do a really good job of covering that up. So that's brilliant. Just let your hair down. That's brilliant. Listen, you got one more story, man. I know you have a lot. You got one more. We got time. Come on, you got one
All
more
right.
cool one.
So another one that was really fun. I'll try to make this quick.
No, you're good, man. Don't worry about it.
One time I actually got to go to Russia and with a victim of a cybercrime. This was one of the very first cybercriminal cases that I ever worked on. This was back around 2001, and I got to go to the Russians. Actually arrested the individual who had hacked into this institution, and the institution was actually provided. So the Russian law enforcement and the court invited them to come testify to the
Hmm.
losses, and they actually did. Which
Wow.
the bank is no longer around. They've been bought several times
Sure.
over. I still won't mention, but it was really cool. The problem was that the case was in late November in
Ooh.
Siberia. So we
Oh,
flew to this place, and the MVD guys in Moscow were making fun of us, saying that like the airport would like drop us off the airplane, and then the reindeer would pick us up and take us to the. And so that wasn't the case. The town we
No.
went to was actually a fairly, it was good. It's kind of little Houston because that's where all the Russian oil and gas companies were based at the
Mhm,
time.
mhm,
So we
mhm.
had a really, they treated us amazingly. We testified in court. I got special permission because theoretically you're only allowed to or to interpret in court, in Russian court, if you are a citizen. But the judge
Hmm,
gave me dispensation since I'm not a Russian citizen, but
sure.
because we wanted to limit the number of people who knew about this, or the victim wanted to limit.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
but after all the testifying and everything, the Russian cops they took us to this dacha, this bathhouse, and which was way out there, and they drove us through these snowy roads, and there was a lot of drinking. There was some young ladies there who they introduced as secretaries, although I
Mhm.
don't think that's what they
They
were.
weren't taking any
And
shorthand?
no, they weren't.
Not a lot of
And
typing going on?
yeah, they were spending a lot of time in the banya with the various individuals and stuff like that.
Mhm,
But I just remember them, the cops and driving us, getting like incredibly drunk, and driving us at very high speed back along very snowy, icy roads, and myself and the representative of the victim institution sitting in the back, kind of between these young ladies, and thinking to myself, man, if I crash
it's
and
over.
this stuff is, somehow gets into the news later,
Mhm.
then it's going to be very difficult to explain this. So yeah, that was a funny story. Fortunately, everything was safe, and nobody's, at least from the American side, nobody's honor was compromised in this case. But it was a very interesting situation, kind of surreal. The victim, he had a special sat phone, and
Mhm.
he's looking at it, it's like the sat phone is saying, "Where the fuck are you?" You know, because we're
That's not a
so
good
far
sign.
out
That's
that
not a good
it
sign.
wasn't able to pick up anything. So yeah.
I'm picturing the Rocky movie where he has to go to Russia to
Yep.
fight Ivan Drago. I'm just picturing that. That was Siberia, right? And just,
Yep.
the cars, the old Mercedes and the heavy snow and not being able to get anywhere. I'm just picturing that, except drunk.
Exactly.
Apparently, everybody was drunk in this case too, which they
Exactly.
should have had in the
Exactly.
movie. That's probably more realistic. So, but I'm assuming you didn't knock out Ivan Drago at the end of this or anything. You didn't win a big
No.
fight and turn Gorbachev onto our side and all that. I guess this was not that.
My liver survived, and
Oh.
yes, I'm good.
Nice. All right, listen. So we always close out the show with the same question for everybody, and this has been my most fun part of the show. Usually, in this case, your stories I think are more fun. But that being said, the name of the show is Unspoken Security. So with that in mind, tell me something you have never told anyone before. Something that's been unspoken so far.
So this is kind of embarrassing,
Oh, I
and
like it. We're off to a good
but
start.
it's probably something that a lot of people feel, and I think actually some of your other guests have mentioned something similar. But I am just really amazed that anyone knows who the hell I am. I'm very flattered, because I don't know if you want to call it imposter syndrome or
Mm-hmm.
what
Mm-hmm.
it is, but in my mind, I'm still some 25-year-old kid who just got out of college and is trying to figure out what the hell he wants to be when he grows up. And so when people come to me and say, "Oh, I read this work of yours," or "I heard this interview with you,"
Mm-hmm.
or one young man who's brilliant once talked to me and actually called me legend, and I almost fell off the chair, because I was just like, I mean, and I'm not gonna pretend false modesty. I went and ran to my wife, and I was like, told her,
Yeah, of course you
somebody
got
called me
to.
a legend.
Exactly.
And and so it was really cool. But I frequently just feel like depending on your age, you'll get this
Mm-hmm.
either Zelig or Forrest Gump, but
Yep.
that I find myself in these instances, like I've literally been standing between the former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, and the current and former head of the FSB, Ipnikov and Patrushev, in the Spasa House, which is the residence of the ambassador of
Mm,
U.S. in Moscow, and
mhm.
I was interpreting between them these and really in this close proximity, and just literally standing with them, and and afterwards, as we were leaving, the ambassador actually pulled me aside and told me I did a great job, and I was just like,
That's
I thought
awesome.
I was going to pass out, but it's one of those things where for any of you out there who experiences imposter syndrome, everybody does. As AJ mentioned, I'm in my 50s, and I've been working in intelligence since I was in my early 20s, and I still feel like I'm just some kid who's trying to figure it out. And so don't
Yeah.
be embarrassed if you feel that way. You can succeed if you try. You work hard, and you don't have to feel like you've got everything and all the answers and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But I don't think I've ever actually said the extent of how frequently kind of unsure and stunned I am by these various things, and sometimes have to kind of like do a little tap dance when people come to me with questions. But that's where research comes in, and being a curious person comes in. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's my kind of unspoken.
Well, and I love that, man, and I appreciate it, and I'm sure a lot of people will because listen, it does come up occasionally, right? And it probably will continue to as I do this. I've been told that people with imposter syndrome, like it's a sign that you're probably both good at what you do and humble, right? People listen, narcissists don't have imposter syndrome. It's not an issue for them, right? It's the opposite of Dunning Kruger. There's plenty Dunning Kruger. There's plenty of people out there who think they're great at everything and they aren't really good at much of anything, and they don't even know it because they're so out of touch they don't even know they're not good at things, right? So I have been told people with imposter syndrome generally are high functioning performers, but they're also just humble and they don't see it, right? Or they're so good at what they do they don't realize how hard it is for other people to do. That's what people have told me before because I suffer the same thing. I don't know why anybody listens to anything I have to say about virtually anything at all, frankly. And when people ask for my advice, I keep looking around trying to figure out who they really mean. But I also
Exactly.
recognize, yeah, but I also recognize there's things I've had people say, yeah, you did a great job. I'm like, yeah, but it wasn't hard. And they're like, no, it wasn't hard for you.
Mm.
And I have to remember that we all have our own skills, right? There's things I can't do that you can do amazingly, I'm sure. Well, I know for a fact, in fact. And I'm sure there's some things I do that I find afterwards. I'm like, it wasn't that hard. And they're like, no, I couldn't do that. And we don't realize that about ourselves, I don't think. A lot of people in this industry, and it's really prevalent in our industry, I think, even more so than others, of just we don't realize that we do things differently than somebody else might do it. Might be faster, might be better, whatever it is. You find your niche, and I think that's the key, right? If you find where you're supposed to be and you're good at that thing and it just comes sort of easy. I mean, it's work,
Mhm.
but it fits, right? I think that's when we get into this track, right? If you're constantly struggling and fighting to do something because it's just not your nature and you're
Yep.
in a bad fit or whatever, you never really worry about it too much. You don't have
Mhm.
imposter syndrome because you're barely getting through as it is, right?
Right.
And when it gets kind of where it's a good fit, I've had plenty of things where I get done and people give me accolades for whatever the thing is I did. And I'm like, geez, I kind of feel guilty about it because I think if you knew how little it work it took to do that thing, you wouldn't be so proud of me anymore. But it's all relative. So, but I think it's a great message. I appreciate you sharing it. I'm sure a lot of people will because yeah, you are a legend, dude. You've been doing this, as I said, a long time. I keep telling that to you, but you've done amazing things. Like you could tell stories. We could have you for hours. We could go on and on. Your stories are awesome. Your knowledge is amazing. I've been lucky enough to present with you and to see you present separately as well. And you are a legend. It's true, but it's hard to see when you're in that. When you're in
Mhm.
those shoes. Sometimes I think so, and I think it's a good message for people to know, no matter where they are. If it's
Yep.
somebody you're just getting into the industry, or if you've been doing it, as long as we have or longer, and you have these feelings, just everybody does, man. I don't know
Mhm.
anybody who's really good at this stuff who doesn't have that feeling. Because again, if they don't, they're probably just a narcissist, and I don't spend a lot of time with those guys. So, like, if you're doubting whether you belong, just keep driving through. Like,
Yep.
you probably do, and especially if other people think so. I've gotten to the point where I look around and like they think I'm doing a good job. I guess I must be because I've long ago given up on thinking I'm doing a good job. So, but
Well,
anyway,
well,
go ahead.
just to final comment on what you
Yeah.
said, I think a lot of times, like one of my favorite sayings is like you can tell the worth of an individual by their friends.
Very
And
true.
so, like, whenever I'm feeling a little bit kind of, a little down or a little unsure of myself, I look around and I've got some kick-ass friends. I've got some really great people that I can call on when I need help with
Hmm.
something. My network has some amazing individuals in it, and I'm so proud of that. And that says, you know what? I I trust their judgment enough to say that I must be doing something
Yep.
right,
Yep.
because otherwise, what the hell would they be doing? Like picking up the phone.
Hmm.
Like I've reached out to CEOs who I really respect, and they'll respond to me. And these are individuals who are like way more powerful, more successful, and wealthier than I am.
Hmm.
And so, and again, not to say that it's all about CEOs. There's this
Hmm.
wonderful junior analyst who I reach out to, who I'm like, oh, this is awesome that this person is willing to help me answer this question. But I think that's something that also, trust yourself when you have other individuals who whose opinion you respect,
Hmm.
trust you, and see value in you.
Hmm.
That says a lot about your capabilities.
Yeah. No, I agree. That's a really good point. I mean, I often joke, when you're on or somebody else, whoever's, I don't know why this person hangs out with me. I don't know why they're friends with me. They haven't done a better job of picking their friends. But, putting the joke aside, you're right. There's lots of people I know that I'm like, all right, this is a pretty good group, and they seem to think all right of me. So, like, it is a reflection at some point, right? If so many impressive people are willing to pick up the phone, are willing to take time, prioritize you, you're important enough to them that they value your opinion or input or whatever it might be. Yeah, it's a reflection. At some point, you got to accept, hey, I guess we're doing okay, right? But I also like having this, like little humility is good. So I don't know if I'd ever want to get to the point where I thought I was good at anything. I'm good enough apparently to get by on some things, and I think I'm
Exactly.
comfortable with that because nobody wants to hang out with the asshole who thinks he's good at everything. Nobody likes those people. So, all right, listen, man, this has been great. I really appreciate you coming on. You've done an amazing job. Awesome stories. We probably have you on again at some point because I know you have a bunch more of them too. But I really appreciate you taking the time to be here, Roman.
Been a lot
I
of fun.
can't thank you enough for it, man. I'm gonna wrap it up here. For everybody listening, please, if you like the show, like it, download it, subscribe, tell your friends and neighbors, get on the highest mountain and scream about it, or whatever it is, right? And if you don't like it, then just shut up and don't tell anybody. No, it's fine. Tell me if you don't like it too. We'll
Yeah.
we'll see what we do to make it better. But yeah,
Next time I'm coming out to Minnesota and we'll be
come
in the same location. It'll be like one of those, again, like sports things where we'll be sitting there
yeah,
with the
man.
cool mics and talking to each other in
Come
person.
on.
So that'll be
Come
cool.
on out and do it, or maybe we'll do it on site at one of the locations. I mean, we
There you
did some
go.
conferences, but yeah, anytime, man. I'd love to have you back on. So, listen, that's going to wrap it up for this one. Again, for everybody out there, thank you very much. This has been another episode of Unspoken Security. And until next time, be safe, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for this episode of Unspoken Security, brought to you by ZeroFox, the only unified external cybersecurity platform. If you enjoyed this episode, follow us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. See you next time.